Well, hello there. Thanks for joining me today. Well, we have a lot to cover today. Oh, before I get started, in the last show, talked about the man who said that he murdered. Uh, remember, I'm just repeating somebody else's words. There was a man in the last show that claimed that he murdered William Colby, the CIA director. Hey, the story sounds plausible, right? But just to be clear, I did email that person and did not hear back. Does that make them guilty? No, not really, but it just shows that there's many, many different parts of this spider's web, so to speak, right? So I think it was really all just right in front of us. The first colonial settlers to American shores came here for one primary reason. Religious persecution was rampant throughout Europe and other parts of the world. Historical witch hunting during the Spanish Inquisition and the 30-Year War targeted pagans. Similar actions and sanctions under rulers like Henry VIII of England were threatening the pagans. You ever notice the patterns here? How, they always become the victims in their own stories, right? They were threatened by King Henry VIII. Well, not so threatened that they didn't join alliance with the UK all along, right? So that's the story, right? So Henry VIII was threatening pagans. So, and then right here in their own words, the first colonial settlers to American shores came here for one primary reason. I think it was pretty much split. I think they had one reason and the rest of us had another reason, the rest of our families. Okay, I'll keep reading. American strives for religious tolerance for all people and citizens. This has always been an ongoing and controversial issue, even in modern times. Constitutional law mandates that all Americans have freedom of speech and religion. American history has been a breeding ground for new religious groups and movements. In the past, America has given birth to such religious groups as the Amish and the Mormons. Modern times have seen Scientology and the New Age movement. All such cults and sects have much to thank for American paganism as it influences the United States. So they're saying that all of these religions, right? Amish, Mormons, and in modern times, they've seen Scientology and the New Age movement. All such cults and sects have much to thank for from American paganism as it influences our nation. So, paganism has learned to be accepting of monolith. So, what this is saying is this is that, we've always kind of been told that, well, religion is monolithic and it encompasses and everything is okay under religion, right? Well, how about if I told you that that script has been flipped, okay? And this is how they flipped the script, okay? Paganism has learned to be accepting of monotheism under Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, just as such religions have had to accept Wicca, Odiism, and Satanism in modern times. American religious tolerance is a key concept to our national unity. Even as each religion is different in conceptual practices, the many pagans seeking religious tolerance in America continues to grow. So we kind of have, oh, I don't know, maybe a different understanding of things. So their understanding is paganism is accepting of all other religions, right? Not what we've been told that, well, all religions accept everything, right? Just like the American Civil Liberties Union, they push this idea that, well, we're going to fight for the rights of everybody to march in the streets of America, even the Ku Klux Klan. So that gives us a lot of kind of ideas, right? Well, how about if the idea was set up to be pagan and they, as pagans, accept Judaism, Christianity, and Islam? Just as such religions have had to accept Wicca, Odiism, and Satanism in modern times. American religious tolerance is a key concept to the national unity. Even as each religion is different in conceptual practices, the many pagans seeking religious tolerance in America continues to grow. Yeah, America, the big melting pot, right? Secret societies throughout the United States history, paganism has had to hide from religious bigotry and persecution. This led many believers from different pagan worldviews to form secret societies within our experimental new society. Yeah, they were forced to go underground, right? Maybe because the people that were coming over here to help out, the Christians and stuff, they needed to be tricked, right? Why did everybody need to be tricked? Well, because there weren't that many of them to begin with, right? So they had to hide somehow, right? So, so throughout United States history, paganism has had to hide from religious bigotry and persecution, just like they sold that story about the Jews. Oh, they gotta hide. Everybody's out to get them, right? They gotta hide, hide, hide. This led many believers from different pagan worldviews to form secret societies within our experimental new society. In the covert shelter of secret cults, many pagans were able to keep their culture, excuse me, in the covert word got me. Okay. In the covert shelter of secret cults, many pagans were able to keep their cultural autonomy. Secret sects allow generations to teach their traditions in private and not lose them. America has many secret societies that have influenced our social and political structure. Ancient mysticism and education came down through the Freemasons, Rosicrucians, and Hermetic lodges. Even modern groups such as the Ordo Templaris Orientis, or OTO, have sought safe haven here. Secret societies flourish to this day in America's culture of religious freedom of speech. Many leaders and political officials have been part of secret societies or fraternal orders. Yeah, almost kind of like they carved out this whole society for all this. Huh, maybe I'm just kind of suspicious. I'll keep reading here. I think what they needed was to they needed people to see they probably started around the 1700s or so persecuting actual Christians and stuff, right? Over in Europe and stuff, around Ireland and stuff, because they needed to cook up a way to populate this country, right? So they probably something as simple as they started persecuting the Irish and starving them. That would give them one huge flood of people, right? So that gives everybody the idea that they're fleeing persecution, right? Almost kind of like the old saying, jumping from the pan into the fire. So the people thought they were fleeing religious persecution. So they hopped on boats, leaving Ireland, heading for the United States. But essentially, they were hopping into the fire, right? Because they were being tricked. So they thought being Christians was at stake, but instead they were heading over to live in the land of Satan. They thought that's why at first they set it up with common law and stuff, and then they had to kick all that out. And that's why now we're under the laws that they cooked up, right? The Admiral laws that came out of the church. So, yeah, evil does indeed have to come packaged as help, right? Hey, come on over here, Irish people. Come on, hop on the boats. Well, part of the reason that they got all those people to hop on the boats was because the returning those boats from, let's say, Ireland to the United States, they had to have some weight to them because remember, they were bringing things over from the United States to those countries. So the boats coming back to get more goods needed some weight. So they used the weight of people, right? It wasn't really about helping anybody. They needed those people. So how did we get sold all this stuff? Well, I started looking at my favorite thing, the old timelines. Why am I talking about timelines today? Well, because there was this whole thing that happened, and what they did was they decided that in order to control things, they would get the idea of anybody talking about ritual abuse sounding like they were crazy, okay? Which I found really interesting going through all of this because I was also put on medication mid-90s. I think a memo went out to therapists and stuff. But anyway, different subject. But how did that lead up to this? Well, first thing I could find was the Three Faces of Eve. And that was a 1957 American film noir mystery drama, and it was based on the book of the same name of the life of Chris Coster Sizemore. And that was written by the two psychiatrists, Corbett Thigpen and Hervé Cleckley. And the two doctors also wrote the screenplay, helped write it. And I talked about that in the last show. And the Three Faces of Eve is kind of what kicked it off. And also remember what they claimed was that Eve White was a woman they suggested might have dissociative identity disorder. And back then, when this came out in 1957, it was called multiple personality disorder. So this is when they first start introducing this idea really about what a bunch of crackpots we all are, right? So, um, so anyway, so then there was that conflict between this person who they claimed to be Eve, and in the end, oh, wait a second. I'm sorry, I don't have good spacing here. In the end, what happened was that it was pretty much discredited, this book, really, by so Cleckley wrote was part of this book about Three Faces of Eve. And then it gets discredited, right? So what does that tell you? Well, because it was mainly made up, right? They basically, and I've got all the documentation for you to look for yourself. I've talked in the past, what they do is they usually come up with cases so that they can have their case law, right? And a lot of times they actually can make up these cases to make them case law. And they say, well, we don't do it all the time. Well, yeah, they do it all the time. So did they make up did they make up this movie so they could bring it into case law? I don't know, because this person's identity, this movie was late 50s. Nobody knew this person's identity until the 1977s. Well, and remember, we're talking about they're trying to discredit false memories, okay? So first thing they have is that movie. Then what they do? Well, the CIA, good morning, Virginia. They came up with this institute called the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, and it made its collective debut. And that also had a book done about it, and that was published 1993. So that was basically how they sold it from the beginning, those two things. And I'll be getting much more into this false memory foundation. But one other thing that I haven't mentioned in the past that really helped sell this was this movie about this person called Sybil, Sybil. And interestingly enough, Sybil, part of Sybil's name was Sybil Mason. Get it, Mason? And also it happened out of Omaha. So, okay, so as explained in the show, both the book Sybil and its TV adaptation brought dissociative identity disorder to the forefront of cultural conversation shortly before. So the book was first published in 1973. Here again, remember, we're leading up to what's going on at the McMartin daycare, right? All those daycare, the satanic panic that I was talking about in the last show. So here again, we have this movie Sybil cropping up in 1973, conveniently about, oh, I don't know, just about 10 years before the satanic panic started, right? And basically, the book was published in 1973 by a journalist, an English professor at the City University of New York. Well, of course, this journalist named Schreibner was close friends with psychoanalyst Cornelia Wilbur, who believed that her patient named Shirley Mason, get it, Shirley Mason, had 16 distinct and separate personalities per the LA Times. Dr. Wilbur determined that Mason had developed these separate identities when she was a child to help her deal with an abusive mother. Sybil, on the other hand, was said to have fragmented as the result of extreme abuse. Her true name, discovered many years later, was Shirley Mason, and she was an art student. Her case set the standard as a syndrome rooted in child abuse. It made multiple personality disorder or syndrome famous, especially after the 1976 television miniseries starring Sally Fields, which was based on the 1973 bestseller. Sybil was described as having 16 separate personalities. So, yeah, conveniently enough, right? And what I'm going to be doing today is I'm going to be publishing all of these notes down below. A couple places, like, I don't know, some of these audio platforms, I know you can access it from my website, all the notes down below, but I'm just going to publish them all so you can copy and paste them, because it would be good if you took a look at all these dates for yourself. So yeah, here we have introduced the television. Let me see. Okay, the book Sybil was a bestseller in 1973, and then it was a miniseries on TV in 1976. And here's how the story went. And also, I have links to both of the movies. I found two. Anyway, I found the movie for free. Get to that later. Okay, let me tell you just a little bit about what Sybil was about. At the age of 31, Mason found herself in the office of Dr. Cornelia Wilbur. She reported sadistic sexual abuse at the hands of her mother. According to the book, says a caller in the New Yorker, she probed the child's vagina, and today's going to be also very graphic the way it goes. I'm not going to start editing out words. So I'll continue. So this is according to the someone in the New Yorker. She probed the child's vagina with a knife and a button hook. She hung her upside down and using an enema bag, filled her bladder with ice cold water, then tied her to the family piano and forbade her to urinate while she, the mother, played Chopin. The mother just sat down and started playing the piano. This apparently had caused Sybil to split into alters who were able to deal with various life situations on her behalf. So here you got somebody who's named Mason, right? Of course, the mother's the one doing something absolutely horrific to this little child. Not saying that mothers don't do horrible things, but what I'm saying is look how they're setting this up, right? So I'm going to keep reading here from this. Many people used this book as their Bible, the case against which all others were to be measured. Prior to that, MPD or multiple personality disorder had been considered an extremely rare mental disorder. Research performed by W.S. Taylor and Mabel Martin in 1944 had come up with fewer than 100 documented cases. So supposedly in 1944, they could only document 100 cases. Okay, now listen to this. However, from 1985 to 1995, there were an estimated 40,000 new cases. Dr. Wilbur, a Freudian psychoanalyst, promoted the idea that repressed memories were the foundation to each of the alters and had to be recovered for the person to become whole again. In 1980, the symptoms became a formal diagnosis. Wilbur opened a hospital ward specializing in multiples. Very convenient, 1980, right? Then in 1998, several publications exposed the case as a sham. So this person listened to the Sybil tapes in 1998 and concluded that this person, Wilbur, had induced the personalities in the patient. Her sessions included hypnosis and sodium pentothal, and her techniques was to name different emotional states as personalities. She would not allow Sybil to protest. Reber realized that no evidence for the reported abuse had been found. Then Peter Swall, a historian of psychoanalysts, discovered that Sybil's so this other person, a historian of psychoanalysts, discovered Sybil's true identity and located her. He discovered that she bore little resemblance to the patient presented in the book. It was the case, said Swallis, that Shirley was only a multiple personality in the full-blown sense of the psychoanalytical setting. Newsweek and the New Yorker followed up these revelations with startling stories. It came out that Dr. Herbert Spiegel, who took over Wilbur's cases while she was on vacation, discovered the deception during a session with Sybil. According to him, she told him that during her sessions with Wilbur, she was encouraged to be Helen or another of her alters, although she was much more comfortable just being herself. According to Spiegel, Sybil was not a multiple, but an extremely suggestible hysteric. He then discovered, he claimed, that to ensure the book deal, Sybil had to be a multiple. It was what the publisher wanted. All three principals involved in the book had died, so it remains for Dr. Wilbur's archives to be opened in 2005 for this debate to be resolved. In many ways, this revelation came as no surprise since it followed on the heels of the highly controversial crumbling of the structure of the MPD movement that had become so popular during the 1980s and early 1990s. To understand why these cases are controversial in the courts, it's important to grasp the history of what occurred. What they did was first they started the actual diagnosis now, just to give you a little basis, okay, because this thing has all been basically rigged up, okay? And just like everything else, later they said, oh, wait a minute, did we say that? Just like, for example, how they got me, they claimed that there was such a thing as a chemical imbalance, which they just came up with, right? None of them ever proved what this chemical imbalance was. And only in the last couple of years did they say, oh, chemical imbalance? Wait a minute, did we say that? Oh, huh. And I will guarantee you, though, even though they have said that it didn't exist in the first place, all this stuff about everybody's bipolar and everybody's got all these chemical imbalances, I will guarantee you that to this day, people are still getting all those same medications. They really, truly are one trick ponies. So let me keep going here. So, anyway, dissociative identity disorder, DID, previously known as multiple personality disorder, and I'm going to have all of this pasted below, is one of multiple dissociative disorders in the DSM-5. So it's in all of their so-called books, right? It says it has a history of extreme controversy. Now, always keep in mind, these are the same people that thought lobotomies were a good idea, okay? Dissociative identity disorder is characterized by the presence of at least two distinct and relatively enduring personality states. The disorder is accompanied by memory gaps more severe than could be explained by ordinary forgetfulness. The personality states alternatively show in a person's behavior. However, presentations of the disorder vary. According to the DSM-5, early childhood trauma, typically starting by 5 to 6 years of age, can place someone at risk of developing dissociative identity disorder. Across diverse geographical regions, 90% of individuals diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder report experiencing multiple forms of child abuse, such as rape, violence, neglect, or severe bullying. And this is what they're saying now, right? For a long time, since the very beginning, they said this doesn't happen. And I'll explain in a minute how they were able to confuse this message, right? Because now they're saying that it can be because of child abuse, rape, violence, neglect, or severe bullying. Other traumatic childhood experiences that may have been reported include medical or surgical procedures, war, terrorism, attachment disturbance, natural disaster, cult and occult abuse, loss of a loved one or loved ones, human trafficking, and dysfunctional family dynamics. There is no medication to treat DID directly. However, medications can be used for comorbid disorders or targeted system relief. For example, antidepressants or treatments to improve sleep. So, yeah, they say that there's no specific medications, right? But a variety of drugs can be used. So, yeah, these include all of the usuals, right? Mood stabilizers, antidepressants, anti-anxieties. What they do is they just change the diagnosis, but they keep the pills the same. So, anyhow, so what they're saying is, uh, I'll keep reading here. Uh, the typical presenting symptoms in different regions of the world may also vary depending on culture, such as alter identities taking the form of possessing spirits, deities, ghosts, and mythical creatures and figures in cultures where normative possession states are common. For example, if you think about, and I'm not saying that this is 100%, I'm just saying off the cuff, okay? Places they talk about, like Haiti, using a lot of voodoo, right? Well, what's going on with that voodoo? Well, they're invoking spirits and deities. Uh, just like I've talked about those Ouija boards, they invoke spirits and deities. I mean, I saw it happen myself. Person who was that I knew very well all of a sudden invoked some spirits and deities. So yes, to get children and stuff to invoke deities and spirits would be very straightforward. So that's why I think part of the reason why they did this with so many kids so quickly, because they probably figured, hey, let's just move in. We'll do it really big. We'll run this operation until we get caught, and then we'll see how it goes. Same way they run every operation, right? They run it until they get caught, and then they put their own people in charge. And unfortunately, the rest of us seem to believe their own people. Like, who everybody seems to believe that Bill Ackman, the billionaire, is the one who shut down the Pornhub deal. You really think Bill Ackman was going in there to shut anything down? Of course not. Him and that blonde woman, they were in there too. The kitchen was too hot. So now what they're going to be doing is they're raising money for lawsuits to supposedly help these victims. What does that mean? Well, that means they control the flow, right? So if your kid has some horrific thing happen to them that they don't want exposed, well, they're not going to let you access that money to sue. Now, are they? So they immediately move their own people into control the flow, control the money, right? How it always works. Uh, so yeah, so they want spirits and deities to show up. So I'll keep reading here. The McMartin preschool case was high profile at the time and became part of what the neuro-linguist programmers called daycare sex abuse. They called it hysteria and moral panic over alleged satanic abuse in the late 1980s and the early 1990s. We'll see now in looking at these timelines, right? We got a couple pretty horrific movies happening before all this, right? that Sybil girl, what a horrific story that is. And then you got that Eve woman just all of a sudden snapping her mind and having three personalities. Just leading up to that, right? So I'll keep reading, but that doesn't mean that wild and impossible stories told by the children don't contain some elements of truth. They went on to say, it's as if debunkers haven't factored in that hallucinogenics and drugs were administered to affect the memory. Scientists in the CIA's mind control fraternity lead double lives. Many are highly respected on the outside, but if the truth were known, they would be deafened by the public outcry and drummed out of their respective academic haunts. Martin T. Orne, O-R-N-E, for example, a senior CIA Navy researcher, is based at the University of Pennsylvania's Experimental Psychiatry Laboratory. He is also an original member of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation's advisory board, a tightly drawn coterie of psychiatrists, many with backgrounds in CIA mind control, experimenting in a myriad of forms. The name of it is the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. What they did was the CIA set up this group called the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. The foundation is dedicated to denying the existence of cult mind control and child abuse. Its primary pursuit is the castigation of survivors and therapists for fabricating accusations of ritual abuse. So their primary pursuit is to get rid of the survivors, right? Anybody telling any stories, they're out to get them, right? Their objective is by dismissing cult abuse as hysteria or false memory, a common defense strategy which may relieve parents of preschool children. In a small percentage of cult abuse cases, it's possible that children may be led to believe they've been victimized. So what they're saying is it may be a tiny percent being led there, right? But here's how it worked. But the CIA and its cover organizations have a vested interest in blowing smoke at the cult underground because the worlds of CIA mind control and many cults merge inextricably. In the 1970s, the diagnosis of dissociative identity disorder rose dramatically after the publication of the extremely popular book Sybil in 1973. In the 1970s alone, it is thought that more cases of DID or dissociative identity disorder were reported than in all of history since 1816, and the famous case of Mary Reynolds. Between 1991 and 1997, over 500 cases of DID were admitted to a single dissociative disorders treatment center in Dallas, Texas. Additionally, as more and more cases of DID were reported, more and more alternative personalities or alters were reported in each case. The majority of cases noted by 1944 manifested with only two personalities, but there was there was an average of 15 cases in 19. So In 1944, they were claiming that these people only had two personalities. But in 1997, they started reporting 15 personalities. In current day, controversy still rages around DID, its diagnosis, and whether the disorder even exists. So, well, this is how you do it, right? You muddy the water. And who do we have in the picture? Well, 1967, Michael Aquino began a 2-year tour of duty in Vietnam, taking part in the infamous Phoenix program. The Phoenix program was an assassination, torture, terror operation that was initiated by the CIA with the aim of neutralizing the civilian infrastructure that supported the Viet Cong insurgency in South Vietnam. So, likely, this Phoenix program was the start of it. And you notice the name Phoenix, right? PP Phoenix. So, the first published thing in 1980, here again, right around that McMartin case, right? In 1980, the DSM-3 was published, and the term dissociative was first introduced as a class of disorders. Imagine that, right? In the DSM-3's text revision, an essential feature of dissociative disorders was a disturbance in the normally integrative function of identity, memory, or consciousness. This rather liberal diagnosis may be partially responsible to the vast uptick in diagnoses of the new diagnosis of multiple personality disorder. In the DSM-4, which came out in 1994, it addressed this somewhat, as it included the specific criteria of amnesia to the diagnosis of multiple personality disorder. And it was now renamed to dissociative identity disorder. And that just happened in 1994. So let's take a look at how. See, I keep finding that we keep going back to around that 1700 period, right? And I'll have it below. Hang on a second. I will have it below for you to take a look yourself, but I find this timeline to be rather suspicious, okay? The first psychiatric hospital in the United States was known as the Public Hospital for Persons of Insane and Disordered Minds. And it was in Portsmouth. It was the first building in the United States dedicated to helping the mentally ill. 1773, okay? So right away, getting those crazy hospitals built, right? 1773. Well, 1820, the railroad was in, right? Had the railroads going. Railroad history of the U.S. is nearly as old as the country, dating back to the mid 1820s. Well, then looky here. The Great Famine happened over in Ireland, 1845, just after they got those railroad cars going. I didn't put I didn't put the orphan trains in here. Anyway, so Great Famine, 1845. What happened next? Well, they invented dynamite in 1866. Better to blow us all away with, right? Dynamite. Guess what else? The United States The first public electricity was provided in late 1881 when the streets of Surrey Town in the UK were lit up with electricity, followed by the US in 1879. And then what happens next? Well, World War I, right? After the assassination of Archduke Franz of Austria, his murder started a war in the whole of Europe that ended on 11 November 1918. I think there is a lot to do with this particular time frame because this 4-year war was fought between these central powers and the Ottoman Empire and the Allied powers. Something happened once they got the electricity and the dynamite going, right? Then they had the Treaty of Versailles and that Hall of Mirrors, right? 1919. That was to impose the harsh terms on Germany. Then we had the Frankfurt School, 1923. Right after they sign that agreement, they get the Frankfurt School cooking, huh? One thing that isn't on here, I'll make a note here, is Weimar. Okay, I'll make a note for Weimar. Okay, so we have Weimar. I'll add that to there. So we have that Weimar madness introduced right in the middle of that, right? Pretty interesting timing that they would just have, oh, Weimar right in the middle of all that stuff. Because, back up here. The Frank, the, excuse me, the Frankfurt School started in 1923. It formed during the Weimar Republic, during the European interwar period. So right there we have the Frankfurt School, right there in the middle, being formed during Weimar, right? Nothing too suspicious about that, right? So that was composed of their intellectuals, that's when they pulled all of their academics into place, right? And they had them all into place by the 1930s. So what happened next? Well, the United States, they triggered the Great Depression of 1929. And then Weimar, the first term of Weimar was introduced by Hitler in 1929. Then guess what came next? The cattle prod, the electric cattle prod, to poke us around. That was introduced in 1930. 1930 to 1972, over 60,000 people were lobotomized. Then they had this really strange deal that just kind of inserts into here from 1939 to 1941. They were learning how to give us high amounts of niacin and things to put us into abnormal states for treatment of abnormal disorders. Cleckley was also practicing coma therapy, where psychiatric patients would be repeatedly put into comas over several weeks through overdoses of insulin and other drugs. And they published this, Cleckley published this in 1939 and 41. Imagine that, right before World War II. Yeah, so Cleckley and them were injecting people loaded with stuff and putting them into comas even before World War II. And World War II was just a continuation, right? And Cleckley also published his first book about us being crazy called The Mask of Sanity. He is considered an American psychiatrist and pioneer in the field of psychopathy. His book, The Mask of Sanity, was originally published in 1941. Huh, imagine that, right along a time for all those wars and putting people into comas. Then what happened next? Well, Operation Paperclip, we now know that they say that from 1945 to 1959, they brought over 1,600 scientists, engineers, and technicians from Germany to the United States. It was lauded as a great success, even though many of the men involved had questionable pasts. Well, yeah, they continued on the questionable paths while they're sitting here. Everybody thought Operation Paperclip, when they uncovered Operation Paperclip, all the historians said, oh, look. They brought over all these people to continue the rockets. Well, they weren't brought over to continue the rockets, now were they? They were brought over to continue the mind business, right? Because the psychopaths like Cleckley were the ones who were defining what psychopaths are, right? Get the guy in the they always put themselves in the position of defining these things, right? So right off the bat, they're the ones defining what's a psychopath and what's normal, right? And you notice they put themselves in the normal class with all other things. Yeah, so Operation Paperclip, 1945 to 1959. Tavistock at the same time, 1947. A group which sought to combine research and the social sciences with professional practice. They basically took what was going on in Germany and moved it over to the UK in 47 and called it Tavistock. So also, Cleckley in 1951, he published a study suggesting the use of electronarcosis for various conditions. In other words, putting people to sleep by passing electric current through the brain without causing seizures, as in electroconvulsive therapy. Stunning with electricity is known as electronarcosis, and killing with electricity is known as electrocution. So, yeah, early on, they just sure seem to be pretty right off the bat concerned with how to get electricity going through our brainwaves to kill us, right? Also, what was the first thing they started killing us with? Electric chairs, right? People first got executed in electric chairs. So also around 1952, Cleckley and them got involved in the insanity defense. They wanted to change the wordings, and I'll leave that for you to take a look at. But yeah, all along the way, well, at least it appears to me that they were rigging the rules, right? So they could make more and more of us crazy. Um, so let me see here. But eventually, as far as this law they try to do, it says, however, 10 years later, a chapter by Cleckley on psychiatry called Science, Art, and Scientism cautioned others against a common exaggeration of the abilities of psychiatry to diagnose or treat in regard to criminal responsibility. So he was warning against a common exaggeration on the abilities of psychiatry to diagnose or treat. When I was younger and I started working in trade shows, one of the trade shows the company that I worked for handled was the American Psychiatric Convention. And I gotta tell you, the people that attended those conferences appear to be rather insane themselves, and I don't have the energy to go into it right now, but it left such an impression that one of the things that the company that I work for did was they hired and arranged for the transportation of people that were going from hotel to hotel, or they would going on tours of things like if they were in Anaheim, for example, they might have a tour bus for them to go to Disneyland or something like that, arrange tours. Or then they also had shuttle buses that would be buses taking them from the convention center to different hotels. So the company that I worked for was the one who hired all of the transportation people, the bus drivers and all of those people, right? And these conventions were pretty big because they typically, and this would have been, I don't know, the specific year is not important, but around early 70s. Um, at that time, they were 20, 50,000 people would show up at these things, right? The overall consensus that I personally heard at the time from the actual bus drivers, the people who the company I worked for had contracted with, their general reaction was, "Man, those people were crazy." They said, "I would never see a psychiatrist." So their reaction was they were in pretty much shock and disbelief at how insane all of these psychiatrists all behave themselves, to the tune that the general consensus, now this was just general consensus amongst the bus drivers that we'd hired to do this, their feeling was these people were too crazy and they would never consult them. And yeah, I've been saying that for a long time. And when did we decide that going and telling secrets to strangers was like, see how they trapped us, right? They got these towns, they got cops in the towns, they got doctors in the town, they got therapists in the town, they got all these people that we actually became lulled into this crazy sense of obedience, right? And showing up and telling our utmost secrets to absolute strangers, right? Okay, let me keep going here. So so they said that it is an example about psychiatrists exaggerating, right? Okay, so 1954, they came up with the diagnosis of multiple personalities disorders. Uh, and by then they were saying, well, it's not really schizophrenia, it's some other thing. They've been making this up as they go along. So then, so then remember, they haven't come up with any official diagnosis, right? So how did they trick that? Well, if you can't come up with a real diagnosis, what do you do? Well, you write a book, right? And you act like you had a diagnosis. So in 1956, Cleckley co-authored the book, The Three Phases of Eve. And so that supposedly was based on their partner, right? Already talked about that. So then, but because what they had done was they had published a research article on the case in 1954 saying how they'd come to view this case as multiple personalities. Handy how that worked, right? So 1954, they published this thing saying, "Hey, we think it's multiple personalities." Then in 1956, oh, they have a book. Isn't that handy, right? So, and they also discuss what is meant by personality and identity, noting how it can change even in everyday senses, or like how you become a new person or not themselves. Such a diagnosis had fallen into relative disuse in psychiatry, but Thigpen and Cleckley felt they had identified a rare case, though others have questioned the use of hypnosis and suggestion in creating some, if not all, of it all. So, yeah, so this is how exactly this whole thing happened, right? So, and then Cleckley had the book, right? So the book also served as the basis for the blockbuster 1957 film, The Three Faces of Eve, and actually starred the most famous actress at the time, and Joanne Woodward. Imagine that, right? Imagine that. So in the book and the film, Eve gets cured. Imagine that. So if you don't get cured, then you're going to be the real loser in all this, right? Because after all, that movie showed us that Eve got cured. See how they can layer in a whole bunch of stuff? And just for the heck of it, what happened around that same time, right after Eve and them start going? Well, they introduced Valium. That was a way, it's called a chemical straitjacket. Valium, introduced 1963, safer and more effective than earlier sedative hypnotic drugs. Valium quickly became a standard drug for the treatment of anxiety and one of the most commonly prescribed drugs of all time. And guess who came up with Valium? Well, none other than the same people, the Sackler family, the same people that then went on to murder millions and millions of people with Oxycontin. Remember those people? Yeah, they started with Valium. They have been an unstoppable force in this eugenics program. So, yeah, when they couldn't trick us with other things, they came up with Valiums, right? And they prescribed Valiums like crazy to women at that time. Cleckley is considered to be the father of psychopathy. He is the one who diagnosed Ted Bundy as a psychopath. It was the very first televised trial in the United States. Cleckley was there. Ever since then, any televised trial in the United States is indeed fake. Fake. All of them are fake. But Cleckley was the one who got it all started with Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy was a fake case. They wanted us to think that psychopaths are the kind of people that hide out in dark alleyways and stuff, right? They didn't want people to know that, in fact, the ones we should be the most concerned about are the ones sitting next to us, hiding in plain sight. So that all started with Cleckley. And then, of course, Robert Hare went to a NATO meeting in the 70s, and he then came away deciding to research psychopaths. And then Robert Hare started pushing this idea of serial killers just like Ted Bundy. Exactly how it all happened. It is called misdirection. Same way they started that foundation. Because Cleckley was the one who was asked to testify at trials after that, but the most important one was the 1979 trial. You notice 1979 is right before the McMartin case, right? Get everybody crazy about some wild killers out there, right? Then you get these kids telling wild stories about sex abuse. See how they started drum beating the whole country? Because Cleckley was a psychiatrist for the prosecution in the 1979 trial of serial killer Ted Bundy, the first to be televised nationally in the United States. After interviewing Bundy and reviewing two prior reports, Cleckley diagnosed him as a psychopath. At the competency hearing, a defense psychiatrist also argued that Bundy was a psychopath. However, he concluded that Bundy was not competent to stand trial, but Cleckley argued that he was competent. So, what happened next? The satanic panic is a moral panic consisting of over 12,000 unsubstantiated cases of satanic ritual abuse, or SRA, sometimes known as ritual abuse, ritualistic abuse, organized abuse, or sadistic ritual abuse, starting in the United States in the 1980s and revised in new editions until the 1980s. So it started this whole idea of satanic panic. It started in the United States in the 1980s, providing the most influential clinical description of psychopathy in the 20th century. So, right there, right there, right there, right there, okay? What else happened around that time? 1981 just so happened that President Reagan deinstitutionalized the mentally ill and emptied the psychiatric hospitals into so-called community clinics. So right then they opened the floodgates. They also, at the same time, but not going to go there right now, but they also, that led to an increase of the prison population. But for our purposes today, right there, 1981, a lot of people who they had on medication and stuff, they just turned them loose in the streets, okay? Guess what happened next? 1992, it went on to say, although this entry isn't directly connected to Michael Aquino, it directly relates to the cover-up of events that he and his pedophile cronies have been involved in. After being accused of molestation as a child by their daughter, Peter and Pamela Freyd, that's Freyd, established the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. So now we have Michael Aquino in the picture, right? Funny how this works, right? What's that song? It's a small, small world. Okay, so this couple, Peter and Pamela Freyd, they established the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, or the FMSF. The original board members included doctors who were directly involved in MK Ultra mind control programs, such as expert hypnotist Martin Orne, ORNE, and Dr. Louis Jolin West, as well as many others who had been accused of child sexual abuse. So this was the original board members of the FMSF. The original board members were people who were involved in the original MK7. It sounds to me, now maybe I'm just kind of paranoid, right? Maybe I'm just tired. Maybe I'm just overly suspicious. But kind of appears to me that this False Memory Syndrome Foundation, if it has the original board members were doctors who were directly involved in MK Ultra, sounds to me, like they'd have a vested interest in making sure that whatever these kids say would be discredited. But I don't know. Maybe I'm just being kind of suspicious here. So let me keep reading here. One board member, Richard Ofshe, OFSHE, is an alleged expert on coercive persuasion techniques, and another, Margaret Singer, was a government expert on cults and cult tactics. Another member, Elizabeth Loftus, is an expert on memory. Boy, that's a pretty good lineup of people there, right? The mandate of the FMSF has always been to discredit the recovered memories of people who report having been traumatically abused as children, usually by claiming that the child's therapist has implanted false memories, and to develop legal defenses to protect for the protection of pedophiles in court. Imagine that. Imagine that. Almost sounds like what they're doing right now at Pornhub, but here again, maybe I have a wild imagination. Maybe I do. Maybe before I die, I should admit to all of you, yes, the government in the United States has in fact been right. I am, in fact, crazy. But for the meantime, I will keep reading. The FMSF has routinely argued in court cases that satanic ritual abuse, or SRA, and multiple personality disorder, MPD, don't exist. Just like that, they don't exist. And the organization and its members have specifically targeted any therapists who claim that they do. This defense strategy, which has proven to be quite successful, has allowed for victims of trauma-based mind control and ritual abuse to be completely discredited, while allowing their perpetrators to continue their activities unimpeded. Imagine that. At about the time that the FMSF was established, a number of mind control and ritual abuse victims were starting to remember being involved in these events. Don't they always say timing is everything, right? And this threatened to expose the perpetrators, so it was important that a means to discredit them was put into place. Imagine that. What do we call this? The kitchen was getting too hot phase? The False Memory Syndrome Foundation, or FMSF, was created by known pedophiles, and its board was fortified with CIA mind control experts who cut their teeth on MK Ultra victims. Many of them are known to be closely associated with Michael Aquino. This organization of pedophiles and mind control experts have been very instrumental in covering for Aquino and other pedophiles while destroying the lives and careers of their victims, the victims' families, and their therapists, even long after these pedophiles performed their vile acts against them. So, this is how it worked. It says this organization of pedophiles and mind control experts have been very instrumental in covering for them. And I found one example of a therapist who tried to speak out. 1995, Diana Napoles was a child protective services investigator in San Diego who was alarmed by the increasing number of children who were reporting satanic ritual abuse starting as far back as the mid 1980s. Napoles went undercover online in 1995 and approached Michael Aquino and several others who were associated with him, while also posting information and evidence relating to these crimes and these people's involvement in them in response. Aquino and his associates, several of them from the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, cyberstalked Napoles for 5 years and finally tracked her down in 2000, thereby discovering her real identity. At this point, Napoles's efforts to expose these people were defeated when Aquino and associates using their power and influence to pose themselves as the victims and accusing her of cyberstalking, as well as engaging in assassinating her character both online and through the media. Nepolis was also targeted with direct energy weapons and set up to appear mentally unstable, with claims that she was stalking various celebrities. This resulted in her spending a year in jail and several more months in a mental facility, and eventually being forced to quit her job. The character assassination continued against her, with someone claiming to be Nepolis posting insane ravings on the internet in order to make her appear crazy. Well, this is a rinse and repeat action, right? I did a show already where I talked about when I uncovered John Ramsey during the John Benet Ramsey murder case. It was the first big CIA psyops, and we all have the internet and the online computer. And when I uncovered that it was John Ramsey, they did that exact same thing. They posted all kinds of crazy things, and they said it was me posting them, trying to discredit me. So that's about all I have to say about that. I have a lot of links for you. This story, as far as this the False Memory Syndrome Foundation story is a big, big story. You could wander into a bunch of directions with this deal because the False Memory Syndrome group also relates to Jim Jones, the Kool-Aid they were drinking over in Guyana, the Sudanese Liberation Army. Well, let's put it this way, just so I can save my breath here. The CIA has been in charge of things since the very beginning. This False Memory Syndrome Foundation is just another one of their operations to shut people down, right? In other words, the operation was getting exposed. They had to shut it down. So what else did they shut down? Well, they shut down the victim's ability to actually come forward and tell the truth because they made the truth appear so insane that not many people would believe them, right? And I'm going to be publishing all of this down below. It appears to me that they had some pretty specific dates in mind, right? This whole deal with Sybil, and I can still tell you today, and I won't, what this Sybil thing is all about. It was a horrific, horrific thing that supposedly Sybil went through. And here again, along with the other three phases of Eve, they both have been discredited. And that tells us a lot about these people. These people sat down and came up with these horrific stories, and then they made movies and books out of them in an effort to discredit anybody trying to talk about what really happened with them. So anyway, so I have several links that are about the CIA and the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. Lots of people know this information, so this is not guesswork. I'm not saying, oh, did they do it? No, no, they did it, okay? So I have several articles also outline how they did it, okay? And also they did it to protect themselves, right? So I have a couple of articles as far as about the McMartin case because that was about satanic abuse that they needed to hide. Before the group before they came up with that group, they had a group called the Committee for the Scientific Examination of Religion, and that that morphed into the other group right about the exact same time. And as far as also down below, if you scroll all the way to the bottom, I've got the links to, I'm going to put the links above all the, what I'm copying to you is all the data from, it's my rough show notes. So, there may be typos in it, there may be this and that, but if you want to look further, then all you really need to start with is just copy that whole blob of text down below and you can do it. And I also have, I found two online copies of the movies. The Three Faces of Eve was done in 1957, and then the Sybil movie was done in 1976. So in any case, I see a pretty good progression here, right? They learn the electricity. They started zapping our brains with lobotomies and stuff like that. I think lobotomies were to learn about zapping our brains. And then they came up with the electroshock treatment. And they're still doing electroshock treatment to this day. The thing that everybody seems to overlook is that one of the side effects of electroshock treatment is it wipes out part of your memory. So if I had let them do electroshock treatment on me, who knows what memory I would have left, right? I think some memo went out. This has all been organized. It's all like their own drumbeat, right? At least that's how it appears to me. So I'm publishing that all down below to see, what do you think? Looks to me like they were cooking up this whole electricity thing to move in for their final disability. So anyway, be safe out there and goodbye for now.